So, I put down, when I had the idea for this afternoon, I gave the title, "What do you do when you haven't a clue?" And I didn't realise how prophetic it was going to be. The good thing is it may not matter. Particularly as it may not matter if the actual manner of covering the material reflects the material itself. You could even learn something from that. There is a particular difficulty for me as the person who's presenting it, and that is that the material is by its nature intuitive. That means it's hard to get a grasp conceptually as to what it is. I think I've got a quite a good inner sense of the subject, but it's more akin to one's relationship with a dream that you remember, rather than a piece of text that you've studied. So, I mean, although I've put in quite a bit of effort into in covering the material as well as I can, I don't have a lot of hard conceptual knowledge to kind of rest on, which is that's a little bit, well, it can be a bit challenging if the main medium's going to be words, and words normally depend upon their ideas and concepts. But there is actually something about the subject matter that actually relates directly to the difficulty in conveying it, and that is that, well, the author that I was mainly studying, happens to be sort of Jordan Perterson, is Naps of Meaning, who's actually drawing upon, I think, Piaget. That he's drawing on an approach to the origins of human culture, which actually based on the whole idea that human culture started when at a time when people didn't have a clue. In a sense, like human culture is a response to the unknown, and that to begin with, and as you can observe with children even now.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I'm late. Just started.
Could be there's a place.
Sorry.
That would be a good place there.
Yeah.
Would
There or
there,
over there.
please? Or yes.
There's chairs over there for everything.
Right.
There's loads.
Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm still in flight mode. Should I have it back?
Is it necessary just to say who Piaget is, or is that going to be explained?
Probably should. Only to say that he's a 20th century psychologist who I don't know all that much about. I mean, he does come into the story because he's the psychologist who built his theories on the observational, the assumption that we understand by doing first. So we kind of do things, or children do things, or even adults sometimes just go ahead and do things. And then they kind of realize what they've just done. And if it works, they repeat it and keep repeating it. And if it still works, then they think about what they've been doing, and if it makes sense, then they kind of describe it, or they kind of represent it in that, well, I did this, then I did that, then I did this. But the thing is that the idea is that our conceptual knowledge arrived at being conceptual after a very long journey in which it started off not being conceptual at all. So this relates to anthropology and kind of understanding of the origins of human culture. So, in this picture, it's a kind of a story. You can imagine that in the beginning, people knew absolutely nothing. In a way that, I mean, in the sense of the way that we understand things. You go back in time sufficiently, and even if you go back to human beings that are anatomically very much like ourselves, with the same equipment as ourselves, they are, as it were, human beings very much like ourselves, but actually not knowing anything in the way that we know things, or we think we know things. So, back then, you just did things. You hunted, you chatted, you kind of plotted, you could have lived in tribes and could have found out lots of things about the people that you were living with. And you could get through your whole life without ever using a concept. That you can just do things, and then you can remember or notice what you just did, and then you can imitate yourself. And then you can, imitate yourself, what you've just done, and you can turn it into a kind of, you can pattern it and turn it into a ritual. And at some point, and then by the time it becomes a ritual, is ready to be turned into a story. So it crosses from being a physical thing that you actually do to being a story that you tell. And then from a story, it can be, you can make it more and more abstract, so it becomes the basis of the teachings of a religion, which in time gives rise to philosophy, giving rise to science, giving rise to highly abstract and all that. I mean, the interesting thing about this story is that it completely bypasses the idea we've had since the Enlightenment, that we arrive at our knowledge by making an increasingly accurate picture of what's out there. Like see, we examine, we investigate nature, and we make we examine what's actually there, and we come to understand it by making conceptual mathematical models of what's out there, and we test it, and we know it's true because aeroplanes fly or all the rest of it. Well, in this model, probably half of human culture didn't have that origin. Half of human culture was like plucked out of the air because we didn't know anything. And there's even an uncomfortable sense still hanging around things like religion and the arts and literature, that they sort of were plucked out of the air, and they don't actually have any basis when looked at from, for sort of modern scientific basis. They did have a basis. They did have a basis that they were, in the sense that the basis is that it was done by acting out. I mean, I've actually had a direct experience of this once when someone got me to do something. It was actually to do a connection with storytelling. And someone told me that if I wanted to get a story, all I had to do was to crouch or stand or position myself like I was a statue of the character that I wanted to write about, and the story would come. And I did it a few times, and it did actually work. That stories, at least things, sort of narratives, they have. It's as though they have a physical origin, like it has an origin in things that you do, and you can sort of pluck them out of the air or pluck them out of one's body by just doing something. So it can be, people can get really have a big problem about meaning, and life can seem meaningless, and all the time there's a very easy solution. You can just kind of do a dance or kind of pirouette or something, and you've got a meaning. In a sense, meaning doesn't have to mean anything. You can just get it by doing something. I mean, I think it's even a recognised therapy. I think where you, if someone's depressed and can't do anything, like have got a reason for doing anything, you kind of get them to do something, and they find a meaning in life after they started doing things.
So do you think there's been some confusion with this earlier way of just learning through trial and error, it seems, and just working out meaning that way, and theoretical science now, which looks to create theories and then seek to prove them?
Well, I think that the old-fashioned scientific model may not still hold the way it did, but until very, very recently, the model was that there was a reality that was objectively there, really out there, that was there waiting for you to investigate. And you could get better and better and get better and better instruments, and you could measure it, and you could actually find out all about it because it's there, and it's sort of it's quite it won't fight back. You can just it's almost like it's sort of passive. Whereas in the older pre-scientific view of reality, which probably covers just about the whole of human history, before 500 years ago, or even more recently, and probably is that that reality is sort of co-created, or at least you kind of reality fights back by throwing at you the unknown or anomaly or strange things or things going wrong. So in that sense it's not passive, it's quite active, in that it will be responding to your attempts to understand it.
Would that fall into what we might consider superstition? You know,
well, it automatically gets, yes. I mean, it all got classed as superstition, or religion got. I mean, just about the whole way of understanding that people that served people pretty well when it was all right to investigate things without really understanding what you're investigating. It's well, actually, this is a.
But in a way, you learn with the process, no?
Well, yes.
Like you just have a question. I don't understand this. I'm going to investigate. I don't really know what I'm looking for.
Right,
But
right.
while you were looking for and you're testing and you're trying, you're learning, I think. So maybe in the beginning you don't have a clue, but while you are trying, you are still learning. Like
Right.
you're already learning, and like maybe in the end, like you kind of have a clue, or at least you have a hypothesis or
Right.
something.
The thing is that when I mean talking about these, well, I mean since Jung they've been called archetypes or learning about archetypes. The difference between the kind of learning situation that early peoples faced is that what you were learning about could eat you or destroy you. I mean, it's quite different emotionally. If you're kind of just exploring an interesting idea, and the worst that can happen is you don't understand it, then that doesn't engage visceral emotions in the way that trying to learn about something in a race not to be eaten or consumed or destroyed arouses emotions immediately. And in that situation, the emotions are part of learning about the object. So we send children to school, and we go to university, and we learn about things that don't eat us, in a way. Kind of the books, what's in the books don't leap up and leave you a puddle on the floor. It's relatively safe. But if you think of the early situation where you don't know what's out there, if you get it wrong, you're dead. That's the kind of the early. I mean, in a way, we got pretty good. I mean, we're all still here, so we got pretty good, generation after generation, of not being.
But if you think, like, for example, in a really, let's say, like non-developed society of gathering people like this, like, people would have a clue, because you just don't have a clue when it's your first time. So it will be, for example, children, but like human children need to be raised by like parents.
Yes.
So like the parents would already have faced a bit of like the dangerous things,
Right.
things that could eat them or like
Right, yes,
or destroy
yeah,
them.
yeah.
So in a way, they would not be like completely clueless, you know,
No,
because
no,
they would
they
teach
w- no,
the others
weren't.
and
They weren't. The thing is that the way that they were clueless, I mean, the way that they weren't clueless was as much that they had the appropriate emotional responses to things. So part of understanding something is to feel fear when fear is called for, or to feel delight or joy or rapture when rapture is called for. And in the primitive way of understanding things, or our first way of understanding things, the fear and the delight in things are not seen as our subjective experience in us. It's in the object. That the world is not a collection of objects, objective things. They're the collection of, well, they're, from our point of view, they're all hybrids, in that they're two things, from our point of view, merged together, but from the standpoint of early peoples, they've not yet been separated. So you've got, you know, rocks and stones and trees and animals as objects that you can, you know, encounter through the senses. But all those things are charged, they're carriers of emotion. So you have not just a lion, you have lion plus terror. You have not just darkness, but you have or nighttime. You have nighttime plus mystery and unfathomability and terror. These things add up to terror, actually.
So it seems that we still have these in our experience, and I'm just wondering I'm just wondering if the idea of early man is more of just a metaphor for our level of sophistication in viewing the world. So we, you know, So I mean that's what I was thinking, because we still have these things that we attach emotional to, you know, emotional significance to. We still have the darkness, the unknown, the scary places, you know.
But then it becomes a concept now, because for example, in my real life, I never needed to fear a lion, you know. But I know that I should fear the lion because of the concept, you know, that it's dangerous.
Perhaps, yes. It's actually not so much lions. I mean, the thing that is actually other people. I mean, in fact, the most dangerous thing to human beings are other human beings. But we learn to manage that, you know, and that governs a lot of how we think. So yes, I mean, in a way, I kind of started off with lions and animals, but when you start looking at social situations in terms of what's objectively happening plus the terror that it inspires, and the two inseparably merge, that you can't actually separate the two. Well, in a way, I'm probably describing a state of mind that people experience and kind of dread, and it's actually very, very difficult because we are actually prone. You might go away maybe and deal with it and read a book on psychology or self-help book or something which kind of teaches you how to carefully sort of prize the two apart, or maybe helpful people might say, well, actually that is just, you know, a bunch of people meeting together to do this ordinary straightforward thing, and it's not, you know, the fear and the terror and the threat is not out there in the people. It's you. It's your subjective feeling that you're feeling.
Or it could be objective if you've,
Well-
if you've stumbled into a situation that maybe you shouldn't have stumbled into.
Yes, but we could. The thing is that I'm when I'm talking about the origins of culture, I'm imagining that I'm talking about a time when the ability to tell oneself that this is just subjective was not available. Anyway, it probably wasn't available because it wasn't that useful. Yes.
Would I be right in thinking that Piaget was primarily known as a child psychologist? And
Well,
he was
yes. I mean,
basically
his
studying this
famous
development
yes.
in the individual through childhood, and this is basically that something that he studied through experimentation, observation,
Yes.
so on and so forth,
Yes.
is being transferred to the development of cultures and societies. from
Yes,
the
I
development of the
think
individual.
actually Piaget as well was also interested in child development, but also interested in religion as well. So I think he made the analogy as well. I mean, often people do. I mean, I think probably in the past 100 years, people have investigated children's behaviour or child psychology, or because they've got a burning existential question that in another age would have been religious.
Is Piaget after Jung, same time as Jung?
Probably a generation or two after Jung, but also Swiss.
How does Piaget fit into Peterson's model of, because you mentioned at the start
Right.
that you're basing this on Jordan Peterson's
Right,
work,
right.
Maps
Well,
of Meaning.
It's what he's taking is this step by step arriving at myth from a physical action, from exploration. That we start off doing things, or actually doing, in fact, probably trying to do things with other people in socially, and then we do it, and it works, and we start imitating what we did that worked. So it becomes a social ritual, which then, one of the subjects that Jordan Peterson goes into is trying to explain why, until very recently, most human beings felt themselves that they were surrounded by gods and spirits and all sorts of invisible creatures, and these days we don't, or we tend not to. And where this route by which we act out something, and then we imitate ourselves, and then we remember the imitation, we turn it into a ritual, we turn the ritual into a story into a myth, is one of the routes that the gods of the ancient world come about. And that we don't understand, when we approach it from the modern standpoint, we miss the whole point. Because people, in investigating mythology, a lot of time and effort into forming naturalistic explanations, like like the gods were primitive man's way of explaining thunder, or why the sun set. So it's kind of, it's that like it was in the 19th century, people tried to explain myth as a kind of primitive form of science, which was superseded and abandoned when science proper began, and it worked so much as an explanation of natural phenomena. It was so much better. But with this way of explaining it, the myths and the gods come about by quite a different route. It becomes not a description of nature or objective reality out there. It becomes a way of representing our experience by creating a physical representation of it, which we can then turn into an image and then a story. So what was a part of people's experience or way of understanding the world is that what we think of as oneself and one's mind didn't seem to have a boundary at one's body. I mean, if you go back that forces from outside us have a hand in what goes on inside us, and what goes on inside us has an effect on what goes on outside us. So it's a kind of in a way that there's a two-way exchange. So when the experience of having a powerful emotion is not that I produce the emotion, like I decide I'm going to have this strong emotion because rationally it's a good idea to have this strong emotion because it's the appropriate way to respond. The experience is more that the emotion comes from somewhere, takes possession of me, and makes me do things governed by that emotion for as long as I'm possessed by it. Which, of course, is one of the reasons why it can be quite frightening to be around people who are possessed by in intense emotion, because I mean we still say that when someone's emotionally aroused, they're not themselves, or you might say, well, I don't know what possessed me, I don't know what got into me. I mean, these things are still in everyday speech. They were taken quite literally once upon a time, in fact not so long ago. And if you go to other cultures, I mean, like even I was talking to a friend yesterday who was working in Japan, and the Japanese still, I mean, in Japanese culture, they still are quite preoccupied with. They have a very rich tradition of ghosts and spirits, and if you the environment is thick with them, and if you do the wrong thing, which generally is to be disrespectful in some sort of way, or if the spirits or gods think you're being disrespectful in some way, then they will intervene. They'll sort of get into you and make mental problems for you. And then what you have to do is you have to go to a priest of some kind who knows how to get them out again, or even better, can give you can tell you what ritual to perform, which will show proper respect to whatever the spirits are guarding, and then they'll withdraw and leave you alone.
This kind of shows something that for me is always with the idea of myths and religion, that it's a very good way to manipulate or to shape people's behavior, you know. Because when you think that you should, like, you know, behave in this way, not to upset the spirits, otherwise the spirits are going to, like, once you start telling this story and people start believing in this story, it's very powerful, no?
Right. Well, in the 18th century in Europe, philosophers told, you know, that they I'm going to say they came up with the idea that the infamous Catholic Church was in was in the business of manipulating people by telling them all these stories about, you know, if you don't do this, then you'll get into trouble, for their priestly purposes, and you know, and so since then, from that time on, it was assumed that it's because people are told or they're sort of indoctrinated that they think like that. That might not be the case. That even if no one actually teaches or indoctrinates people, that if left to themselves, people will come up with these kinds of ideas. I mean, actually, this is in British culture, in one of the sort of founding episodes of English Romanticism is when Wordsworth describes the episode where he steals a boat and he rows out into the lake, and everything's going along sort of fine, when suddenly, as he rows across the lake, a peak that was hidden suddenly appears above the horizon and terrifies him as a kind of threatening presence that tells him that he shouldn't have done this, that he's done wrong. And so he turns around and takes the boat back to where he found it. And I mean, that's and Wordsworth made quite a big thing of how when he was a child he had experiences like that, and he thought that was the origin of some of his best moral ideas. That he, you know, when he was a child, he experienced himself in an environment. I mean, he called it nature in 18th century fashion, where there were in the things around you forces that would warn you or get inside you or make you behave as you should behave, very much as contemporary Japanese will kind of be a bit concerned about walking along a beach where a significant event has happened and not kind of walking along in a disrespectful way, in case the spirits of the beach might come back. There might be consequences. It's sort of it's. I mean, the Wordsworth example, or the example of from contemporary Japan, where people after people walking on a beach where there'd been a tsunami, and just walking along the beach as though it was just a beach, and then afterwards, then realizing what they've just done and becoming ill because it was they were kind of disrespectful to whatever. That these are examples of the human mind naturally, automatically experiencing things in two things together. Objective, places, objective things, people, and intense subjective emotion, which is not seen as subjective. The subjective emotion is actually, we actually experience it as out there in the thing itself. I mean, it can have really bad. It can have really troublesome effects where a particular group of people, a minority, that are kind of marked out by some difference by the surrounding people, are identified as being evil or bad or wicked or something, threatening. And the two things that the subjective feeling and the objective situation are they kind of automatically rise up together, join together, and only with a lot of care and awareness are they kind of prized apart.
So myth can be wrong or corrupted in certain ways, like attaching a myth to a certain race. That's shouldn't be doing that possibly, or like say some priest, maybe some corrupt person trying to
right, yes.
Sort of further his own end. So it could be corrupted in that way, but generally speaking, like the idea you were giving of myth as being this human creation over vast periods of time, sort of working out the best way to sort of go about things is actually probably quite solid in general. It's probably quite a good foundation to base the way you act on. And it might be a risk to depart from that, but we seem to have departed from that.
Whether or not, yes, I mean, in from the late 18th century onwards, there was a reaction to 18th century thinkers who were there's one school of thought was saying that if we can be rational, reasonable in emotional terms and separate out the two, and in fact banish the idea of evil and occupy ourselves with minimizing as much pain as we can for as many people and maximizing as much pleasure as we can for as many people, and doing it in as rational a way as we possibly can. I mean, there was Bentham had a thing he called the felicific calculus, which was like sort of calculating. I mean, I don't know whether anyone ever made it, but it was like you can make a sort of calculating machine where you could sort of decide what government policy should be by feeding in the data, and then out would come, the maximum happiness for as many people as you could possibly be achieved, even if it meant suffering, dreadful suffering for some people. But if you crunched it through the philosophic calculus, you could work out that maybe that it would be wrong to interfere with the laws of economics in Ireland by sending over lots of potatoes or grain during the potato blight, because in the bigger scheme of things it was better that the economic forces were allowed to take their natural course, because it would be better for everyone.
There's I think it relates to the thing you were saying earlier about traditional sort of science and its objective reality of being a reality that's passive but can't bite back. Most of the comfort and obsession in scientific education I had was kind of about the reverse. Was kind of that it was our passivity, that we could choose to simply not affect reality and therefore observe it in its natural state. That if you like, the lion is fierce because lions are fierce. The lion isn't fierce and growling because you're there. You're just you're behind a television screen or something, and that therefore. You can choose, if you like, a wise course of action because you can see how things operate entirely in your essence, in their natural state. And that was kind of it was our passivity that was...
What I mean by nature being passive is that the fierceness of the lion stays with the lion. It doesn't cross the invisible barrier and come into you. So it's like the quality, the emotional quality that we ascribe, and how much of the fierceness of lions is actually what we feel in their presence. I mean, lions are probably just getting on with the lion business. But it's like, imagine the mentality, which isn't all that far from us, is that there's the fierceness in the lion that lion so evidently has. If we make a lion headdress or a lion mask and we put it on, then the fierceness in the lion crosses over and can come into us because there's no real barrier. So this is, to some, for good reasons, we've freed ourselves from that, from that kind of mentality. Or well, for entertainment, for entertainment purposes, because we enjoy it, we kind of go and see films and we do things which actually uses that ability to kind of abolishes that division between the frightening thing out there and us.
But isn't there a danger that leads to us taking things a bit personally? That if you like, the coldly scientific viewpoint, that sometimes has been much too cold, thinking of Elizabeth Earthquake and Candide and all that lot, is that, volcanoes erupt because that's what nature does, independent of us. We just don't matter. We're not. Right. It's irrelevant whether we're there or not. Right. If you like, walking on the beach where the tsunamis happen, but they're just two entirely independent, irrelevant things. As soon as you break down that barrier and let things seep in, then it's kind of like, the volcano erupts because you've done something wrong. You're a bad person. Whatever. It's kind of you're kind of you're involving yourself in narrative in a way that's.
With this more archaic way of experiencing the world, from that standpoint, the volcano erupting and something being wrong, it's not always, or not particularly, that you as an individual have done something wrong. It's that there is a sort of, what word can I use? Because we don't have the words for it, because we don't use the idea. There's a certain, well, I mean, there's the word miasma or cloud or thing, which embraces both the destructiveness of a volcano and disorder in human society. And it's not just a poetic metaphor. There is a thing, a level at which the two are the same, and that's that's a more real level than the level that we experience when we see them as separate.
Is that the culpability, perhaps, of the people around the volcano who perhaps should have known that it might erupt sometime soon and not lived so close by? So that's the sort of...
I mean, I can see it is crazy. It is completely...
Oh, what I was thinking of was that Vulcan was a cuckold, wasn't he? It's basically the...
right.
It's how the two things get...
Well, yes, yes. I mean, I mean, this is in Ovid, the creation myth, which involves a flood and a destruction of all living things. Now, how does that happen? How does that get to be believable? How was it then that when myself and Jose got together and created a kind of sound and word fiction? We sort of carried everyone with us and had everyone living through the destruction of the universe. If at some level this sense that there is we're still sensitive to that level of experience where a natural disaster and how human beings behave are not two things but one thing. I mean, this is the weird I mean, our minds do it. I mean, they do it when we're dreaming, and they kind of do it, and our minds do it when we're not looking. But our minds play tricks on us, where they do things like that. They take what people do, actions, and what events that happen, and they just, by sleight of hand, throw them together as a single thing. It's like, I mean, the reason why cartoons work, you pick up any cartoon book or any, and you know you're immediately enthralled, and you know exactly what's, you know, you kind of you don't have to read a manual to learn how to understand a cartoon strip. It's completely natural. Children, you know, as soon as they can look at something, can understand a simple cartoon strip. And the cartoons depend precisely on this, that you know, a character in the cartoon does something, and it makes sort of jugs and cars and jump about as though they're all made of the same stuff as his thoughts. In fact, you know, if you make that just suspend our normal way of looking at things, and just say that thoughts are as much objects as objects that we depend on, and also that having a thought can, as it were, kind of the sort of cloud bubble, emerges, with a hammer, and then the cartoon character takes the hammer out of the thought bubble and hits someone with it, or maybe the hammer in the thought bubble hits someone, the next person next to it, which makes complete sense.
So it's like, as like people, let's say primitively, they know that if they plant something, they would have a harvest. So like they had that subjective experience that they were the center of the universe. Intuitively, they would think that, okay, if I did something bad to the spirits, that's going to be a tsunami that is coming to...
That might actually be almost too rational an explanation to how people saw it. Because it's quite possible that they didn't even think, I'm planting this harvest because I want to get a yield. They thought of what they were doing. Well, if they thought of what they did it. And then if they thought of what they were doing, they thought of it as a mythological story which had grown out of observing their actions. So it's that if you want, if you're involved, like in artistic activities, which is good, if you want to create something, you start doing something. You can't. You start. If you want to make a piece, you start tapping. And then the piece of music comes, or you don't. Or you pick up a brush and you just start making some strokes. To get started on creative activities, the way artists go about it is they just do something. They start doing. They don't think. They don't. They kind of. They do an action, and then they look at what they've done. Or they don't even do that. They just carry on, and then the thing. The idea of what they do, what they did, comes later after, in fact, the crucial stage of creativity has been passed. It's like creative works get through most of their gestation without... There's awareness of what you're doing, but not awareness of, not awareness of, what's the purpose of it? I'm trying to describe something that it's difficult because there aren't words to describe it. One of the reasons why I think creative processes can be misrepresented or unfairly neglected is that it's difficult to put into words exactly what's happening, and it's actually it happens without it being put into words anyway. But if a thing is happening, if a thing happens, and there's no way of pinning down what's happening or what's being done, it's hard to give an account of what you've just done if you were required to do so. It's like If you live in, then we have a culture where there's a notion of accountability, and in many situations, your job or your work depends upon filling in, a form where you give an accurate, acceptable account of what you've just done. You did a situation, you've dealt with it, and you report. You write an account of what you did. In creative activities, you could invent. There is no accounting, or if you attempt an account, it's nonsensical. Or you could say, well, I just did it. Where did it come from? It's kind of. I think. The whole idea that the world at some point was created out of nothing, or was sort of created just made. There are two ways. You can have accounts of creation where it just appears out of nothing, and then you can have accounts where there's a plan, and and there's sort of blueprint, and it's carried out. And sometimes cultures have both.
But that if it comes from nothing, or you have somebody who created a plan, that just seems it's pushing the problem back a bit, because the person who made the plan.
Where did the plan come from?
Yeah.
Well, the plan came from someone doing a dance. Of course, that's the thing that we keep quiet about. It's like at some point you take the rational plans back, and at some point someone just did a dance and plucked something out of the air. What was Louis XIV doing when he was so obsessed with dancing? And said, the state, that's me. And then a lot, and so much came out of that. But the thing is outrageous in a sense. That the excuse for pounding the French peasantry into dust was so he could dance magnificently. Well, no wonder they had a revolution. But of course, the thing is that there is it may be inescapably part of the human predicament. It's sort of we can. It's acceptable to have plans and have everything kind of charted, justified, and ruled out on a grid. But at some point, in order to sustain that, something has to come out of thin air. And that's quite unnerving. It's like if you kind of stop and think of our immensely complicated, intricate life where, as never before, 7-8 billion people are all interrelated, in ways that we can't even imagine, and that perhaps it's all resting on thin air, and maybe that's perfectly okay, because it couldn't be any other way. Although if one thinks too much about it, one would get thrown into a panic. So maybe I was intending to talk about myth. So maybe I'll give you. Let's have a bit of genuine myth. So this is the ancient Babylonian story, probably the earliest writing, or the earliest sort of strand of writing we've got access to, of how the world as we know it came into existence. So in the beginning, or in fact, there wasn't even a beginning, because I'm talking about the whole notion of beginning was actually irrelevant. So, yeah, I'm already in problems.
Once upon a time.
I haven't even started. Anyway, there was this indissoluble mass of undiscriminated indeterminateness without boundary, limit, interior features. If it was relevant or possible to talk of opposites, which it wasn't, you couldn't, because all the opposites were completely merged into each other. Now, this initial starting point, this being myth, kind of mythic account, you imagine as two people, the primordial couple. And they, for some reason, who knows what, or why, because it being a myth and a myth of origins, there's no reason for this. They are pulled apart and made the first distinction. And of course, once you've got the first distinction, you've opened a kind of slit, or a kind of and then which is like the floodwater of distinctions can sort of burst through. And what springs from the first couple are the first generation of gods. So, I mean, it's quite characteristic of this mythic way of thinking that all there is are gods. What the ancient Sumerians thought of as gods. And as far as the Sumerians were concerned, that's still the case. In a way that there was one pre-Socratic, a Greek, who said that the world is full of gods, which was and in this way of imagining things, the world's not made up of matter or mind or objects. It's all sort of gods everywhere, everything. Well, okay, so we've got the first generation of gods. We've got the first distinctions. And then now that you've got that you've got characters, a bunch of characters, they start doing things. You know, they start sort of messing about, and then and then things immediately go from bad to worse. Apparently, one of them, one of the first generation of gods, goes and kills the primordial father god, and annoys the primordial mother god because they're making a racket. In fact, they're just doing too much. It's like the people having a party in the room, in the flat upstairs. That they just she gets really, really, really annoyed, and she gets so annoyed that there's so much going on in the world that she decides the world's got to be destroyed. She's going to make a flood, and everything's going to be made nice and quiet. And so she gets busy, making monsters and things which are going to flood the world and destroy it and make things quiet again. The gods, in the meantime, get news that the primordial goddess Tiamat is about to destroy the world, and they get into a bit of a panic. They kind of think, they don't want to be destroyed. They want to carry on making a noise and doing things. So, but their first attempts to stop her shows that she's too powerful for them. I mean, her monsters are actually too monstrous, and they get really frightened. Now in steps the hero of the story, and the hero is the hero because instead of trying to match might with might or power with power, he's the god of light, knowing, understanding. And he says to the gods, leave it to me. I'll handle the demoness Tiamat and her monsters. But what I require from you is that you accept me as the ruler of all the gods, and you give me the tablet of destiny so what I say goes, and I'll deal with her. And so the god Marduk, he's chief god of the Babylonians, defeats Tiamat, divides, creates order, and from the blood of the worst of the monsters create the race of mankind, who he creates in order to serve the gods. And he creates a sanctuary where the gods can rest, and that's the city of Babylon. So and this story was told every year in Babylon. It was the kind of the reason, instead of the sort of Declaration of Independence, where you say that kind of man is born to be happy. The message, the political message, is that humankind is an afterthought to the gods. The origin is from the absolute dregs of the worst of existence, and that one's purpose is simply to serve the gods, and one should sort of start off knowing one's position, getting things the right way round. I mean, you can understand why people. There was in time a reaction to the mythic way of looking at things. I mean, I suppose you could say, well, we might kind of wonder, well, I mean, there's a sort of a wry truth to it, and subsequently in the development of human history, we tell other stories in which we're quite emancipated and probably freeing ourselves of these multitudes of gods. It's probably a good move in terms of our freedom and happiness, as we might tell the story, because having lots of gods around usually spells subjection and having to work for them, because it certainly did in the ancient world. But that's the thing that what I take it, that what's behind this kind of rather, well, sort of drastic view of a world dominated by gods, so dominated by gods that human beings hardly have space to move, is that ancient peoples had such a strong sense that the human mind is so prone to invasion from things outside it. Or at least, it's a sort of way of looking at things where our whole emotional nature, probably even our physical nature, is actually part of something outside of ourselves that are the gods, the world of the gods. And that we are quite inhabited by forces that are foreign to us, and that we have to serve and keep on the right side of. I mean, you may be just deeply thankful that we don't live in ancient Babylonia, or kind of one day.
There's also a way of not taking responsibility on the things, no? Because everything, it's like, it's the wish of the gods, and everything that happens because some god wanted or said it. So, like, people don't really take responsibility of things.
Well, they might have looked. I mean, in a way, it's a mentality that's, well, it's now so foreign, or apparently so foreign to us, that it's actually quite difficult for us to imagine it. But it's lived on in imaginative literature. In a way, we have largely banished it. But we pick up a piece of popular fiction or watch a popular film, and it's all back again. I mean, I mean, people say, I mean, like, you kind of, the subject of a typical blockbuster movie is usually some amorphous, anarchic, chaotic force from outer space, or from somewhere, something is taking over human beings. Zombies are walking all over the place, all that sort of thing. And of course, people are glued to the screen because they're absolutely fascinated. And it just might be that we're not so distant, from the ancient Babylonians, kind of, I mean, the difference is that we don't build our political structures out of our ideas about zombies. Though one might wonder sometimes. But actually, I think it's time for a break. I promise. I think a tea break little break.